Now, normally, ladies and gentlemen, I save the annual reading of the true story of Thanksgiving from my second book, See, I Told You So, to close to the end of the third hour of the program today. And I have found that, I become so expansive and I begin to ad lib, and add various observations to the reading, and I find myself in a hurried state trying to finish it. So I think I'm going to open this hour with the reading of the real story of Thanksgiving. It's important to do it each and every year. When I discovered what it was when writing the book, I learned that even I, as a young boy, had not been told the entire truth of the first Thanksgiving. And the story I was told was somewhat mild, and then over the years it got worse and worse and worse. So I could probably sum it up by saying that the story of Thanksgiving, as generally taught in the American public school system, was that a bunch of haggard people from Britain arrived at a desolate spot at a very cold time of the year and didn't know what the hell they were doing and didn't know where they were and had no idea how to live. And then they met some Indians, some Native Americans, and the Indians saved them. The Indians showed them how to farm. The Indians showed them how to make warm coats. The Indians showed them how to make pumpkins and carve them. The Indians showed them how to go out and kill turkey. And if it weren't for the Indians, the Pilgrims would have starved, and there never would have been an America. And then the Indians would have never been overrun. And then there wouldn't be any Indian casinos. Well, there might have still been Indian casinos, but there would not have been an America. And therefore, we owe Indians that's essentially the story of Thanksgiving that people were taught. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's how it was. Even I, as I say, was taught a mild version of that. And it is nowhere near the truth. And for the truth, I found the journals of William Bradford, who was the original governor, the original Plymouth plantation, and one of the primary movers and shakers of putting together the journey on the Mayflower that brought these pilgrims to the New World. So I wrote about it in my second book called See, I Told You So. In chapter 6, Dead White Guys, or What the History Books Never Told You, the True Story of Thanksgiving. If I have time, I'm also going to share with you excerpts from George Washington's first Thanksgiving proclamation. If you're unfamiliar with that, it will startle you. The story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century, the late 1600s. The Church of England under King James I was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize its absolute civil and spiritual authority. Those who challenged the ecclesiastical authority of the Church of England and those who believed strongly in freedom of worship were hunted. They were put in prison, sometimes executed for their heresy. A group of separatists, people that wanted no part of that in England, fled first to Holland, and they established a community among themselves there. After 11 years in Holland, about 40 of them agreed to make a perilous journey to what was then called the New World. They would face hardships and experiences that none of them could foresee, but to them it was worth the try, because for them the objective was to live and worship God according to their consciences and their beliefs and their desires. So on August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail. It carried 102 passengers, not all of them pilgrims. 40 pilgrims out of the 102 passengers. They were led by William Bradford. Now, on the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, for all of the pilgrims to agree to and sign that established law, just and equal laws for everybody, all 40 pilgrims in the new community. Didn't matter what their religious beliefs were. None of that mattered. They just set up a contractual agreement that dictated behavior and a number of other things. Now, where did the ideas, this is the Mayflower Compact, by the way, is what it was called, and where did the ideas for the Mayflower Compact come from? They came from the Bible. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments. It was the reason they lived. To be religious, to study it, to practice it. They looked to the ancient Israelites for their example. And because of the biblical precedents set forth in Scripture, this is all according to Bradford's journal, they never doubted that all this would work. They were supremely confident that their objective would occur. But everybody knows this was not a pleasure cruise. It was long. It was arduous. There were the usual bad relationships and problems on board this tiny ship with 102 people. But they made it. They made it in ways that people would not travel today. They had no other choice. Think of the primitive forms of navigation, lack of knowledge of any upcoming weather or condition of the seas. Yet they did it. And when they landed in New England in November, they found, according to Bradford's detailed journal, nothing. A cold, barren, desolate, unsettled wilderness. There were no friends to greet them. There was nobody to greet them. There were no houses. There was no shelter whatsoever other than the trees. There was nothing that could be considered creature comforts whatsoever. There were no friends. There were no hotels. There were no bathrooms, no place to refresh themselves. And the sacrifice that they had made for freedom was just beginning. They arrived at the onset of winter. Half of them, half of the first 40, including Bradford's own wife, died of either starvation, sickness, exposure. No houses, no hotels, no Safeway, no American Express. Nothing. They endured the winter as best they could. Spring finally came. And the Indians, the Native Americans, did welcome them and did teach them aspects of farming, planting corn, fishing for cod, how to skin beavers for coats, and their lives improved. But they were nowhere near prosperity. Now, this is important to understand because this right here, at this point, is where modern American history lessons often end. This is what the traditional Thanksgiving story is. Pilgrims arrived, barely made it through the winter. Indians befriended them and saved them. And today, to this day, we give thanks to the Indians for having saved the Pilgrims. This could not be further from the truth. This is not to diminish the assistance, but this is not what Thanksgiving is about. Thanksgiving is actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives, but that's not what it was. Thanksgiving, in truth, my friends, is a devout expression of gratitude to God for their survival, which depended on a whole lot of things after they arrived, a whole lot of things besides assistance from the Indians. Here's the part that's been omitted. The original contract the Pilgrims had entered into, the Mayflower Compact, with their merchant sponsors in London, they had no money. They had to have people help them here. That original compact called for everything they produced to go into a common account, a common store. Every member of the community was entitled to one common share. In other words, everybody got the same as everybody else. That's the way it was set up. This was fairness, and it was equality. All of the land they cleared and all the houses they ultimately built belonged to the community, not to the people personally. They were going to distribute it equally. All the land they cleared. Nobody owned anything. They just had a share in it. It was a commune. Pure and simple. It was a forerunner to the communes we saw in the 60s and 70s out in California, and it was complete. They had organic vegetables. Bradford had become the new governor of the colony. He recognized that it wasn't working. This was collectivism. Nobody had any more than anybody else. Nobody had any less. But that did not lead to prosperity. It never does. So after a while, realizing that there was nothing but stagnation going on, Bradford assigned a plot of land to every family to work and manage, and whatever they produced was theirs. And in an early fashion, this unleashed the power of the marketplace. The Pilgrims discovered and experimented with what was socialism. Long before Marx ever lived, they found that it didn't work. You know why it didn't work? When everybody was entitled to the same, you have slackers. Slackers didn't do their share. They didn't contribute their share, but they got the same amount as everybody else. It led to recriminations and jealousies and anger. Bradford had to change it, and he did. And what Bradford, it's all in his journal, what Bradford and his community found was that the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anybody else, unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation, i.e. keep a majority of what they produced or earned. Now, most of the rest of the world has been trying to experiment with socialism for over 100 years, trying to refine it and perfect it and reinvent it. The Pilgrims learned in less than a year that it was a failure. What Bradford wrote about, this social experiment, should be in every history lesson in school today. If it were, we might prevent a lot of needless suffering in the future. He wrote, "The experience that we had in this common course and condition tried sundry years, that by taking away property and bringing community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing as if they were wiser than God. For this community was found to breed much confusion and discontent. It retarded much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For young men that were most able and fit for labor and service didn't. They waited while other men's wives and children produced what they should have been producing. And eventually this was thought to be a great injustice. Why should you work for other people when you can't work for yourself? What's the point?" The Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without incentive. So what'd they try next? They unharnessed the power of good old free enterprise by invoking the principle of private property. Every family was assigned its own plot of land to work. They were permitted to market whatever they produced, able to sell for whatever price they could get their crops and their products. What do you think the result was? Well, Bradford wrote, "This had very good success, for it made all hands industrious," means everybody got off their duffs and started working. Much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. This is when they first began to experience prosperity. And it is for this discovery that after, by the way, it was at this point that they welcomed the Indians in, because there was so much production after that first barren winter of arrival, not knowing anything, not having anything, trying, everybody getting fair treatment didn't work. When they unleashed the incentives, stated simply as you get to keep what you produce, it turned everybody into, compared to the past, mass producers. They had so much more than they needed that they actually had a gratitude dinner with the Indians where all of this bounty was shared. And the original Thanksgiving was to give thanks to God for the enlightenment and the courage and the fortitude to withstand all of the hardship and to endure all of the hassles and the problems, to finally see through it and prosper. They set up trading posts. They started exchanging goods with the Indians, buying and selling. And these profits allowed them to pay off the debts they had to the people in London and Holland who had sponsored their trip. The success and prosperity of the Plymouth settlement attracted more Europeans, and it began what became known as the Great Puritan Migration. It was the word of success and prosperity among the original Pilgrim arrivals that spread to the New World and spawned massive additional trips to the New World. You could reduce it to say it was capitalism versus socialism, which it was, but that would be to underemphasize what really had happened. A people who had undying faith in God survived circumstances that they never knew they were going to face and ultimately prospered, and at the end of it all were still able to practice their religion as they chose, which was the original reason for their trip in the first place. And for all of that, they were eternally thankful. And that is the story of Thanksgiving.